Okay, thanks for coming today, everyone, to the second part of our Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging and Course Design workshop series. Today, we're going to be focusing on equity, inclusion, and how you design and present your assessments and assignments to your students. So to give you an idea of what we're going to be talking about, I want to start, because this is March, by touching on the idea of Women's History Month, what that's intended to do, and kind of what it means and what it leaves out, as a way to think about why we're talking about equity and inclusion specifically today when we talk about what students are doing. Then I want to get your input on strategies you already use for equity and inclusion, which we've got a Google Doc where we'll do some brainstorming activities together. And also share some strategies with you that, in the case of transparency, which some folks have heard about before, is very well studied. And then thinking about agency and also modes of doing assignment or types of assignments, and how those can serve to garner student interest, to encourage people to think about different types of perspectives, and also to meet certain universal design for learning needs. The hope is that a large chunk of this workshop time will involve collaborative work from all of us, and input from people based on their experiences working with students and teaching, as well as working on your own actual practical assignments that you have been focused on to this point. So that's what we're going to do today. So our first thing to think about, Women's History Month. And I'll give the caveat here that originally this workshop was going to be in February. I was going to frame it around Black History Month, and Black History Month is actually an even better example, I think, of what I'm going to talk about here than Women's History Month is. Women's History Month, as you may know, has been a thing since 1987. It recognizes the contributions of, surprise, women in history. You might encounter it in different ways. So it's something that is used as a curriculum stepping stone or platform in public schools. I, as an adult who doesn't have children, encounter Women's History Month mostly through social media posts. And other people might not encounter it at all, or might not know that March is Women's History Month until we get to March every year. So I'd like to get your input quickly in the chat in our call. What do you think is the intent of Women's History Month? And in your experience, how does that play out? What does it look like? How do you notice that Women's History Month is occurring? So just throw some ideas in the chat real quick. Okay, I see education and empowerment, building community. So Lisa, are you thinking of campus events? Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Yeah, celebrating past achievements. Okay. Rebecca, there we go. Raising the awareness of the accomplishments of women, recognizing the complexities of what it means to be a woman, and recognizing the roles that she plays. Yeah, so I'm focusing on women's issues, women's political and social issues. Lisa says activism and empowering our students to activate. Yeah, these are all great, great pieces, I think, of what Women's History Month is intended to do and how it, appears in our communities. And I'm glad that you brought up education and activism in there, because I think that Women's History Month is a very powerful thing and does have the potential to really inspire how we think about what's going on around us. On the other hand, it can also be a venue for sort of tokenistic historical representation. So, Freddie mentioned like past historical achievements. And in the first workshop in this series, the first workshop in this series was about diversifying your course content and bringing in better representation, more different perspectives, and particularly perspectives and identities and achievements that have been sort of erased or disguised in the discipline you're teaching. But one of the challenges of doing that is that it can fall into sort of token representation. So one of the examples I mentioned in that workshop was Ada Lovelace, who was basically the first computer programmer. And Ada Lovelace is one of kind of the go-to figures in computer science for talking about, diversity in the history of computer science. And she was exceptional and certainly deserves to be remembered. On the other hand, there were many other women programmers, cryptographers during World War II who disappeared from view as programming became associated with and dominated by men. Why do I bring this up? I bring this up because one thing that thinking about equity and inclusion, as opposed to just diversity, takes us into is thinking about the perspectives of people who are not heard, who are not considered exceptional by, the media or historical establishment or politicians, but who have knowledge and skills and are really part of these conversations, or should be, but are not necessarily recognized. And so some of the strategies that we're going to talk about today are intended to help us move from thinking about the kind of tokenistic diversity and representation into thinking about how can we honor and recognize our students' knowledges and the knowledge that they may have based on experience in our courses, in our assignments, while still meeting our outcomes and, holding those assignments to those standards like Mike was referring to before. By the end of the semester, you have to know the material in Calculus 1 and have those skills. So this is kind of what we're wading into with what we're going to do today. And this raises a couple of big questions. One is, what would it mean to validate and welcome both academically traditional ways of making and showing knowledge in college, and also marginalized or underutilized ways of making and showing knowledge from our students when we decide what they're going to do and what we're going to do. And then the other piece of that is, how do we strive for equity? So let's think for a second about these vocabulary pieces. There we go. So this is some information that I used in the first workshop in this series. And I just wanted to put this out here so we have some common definitions of diversity, equity, inclusion, and inclusive pedagogy. And today, what we're really talking about is inclusion and equity. Not that these other terms aren't important, but this is kind of where we are. So inclusion in this sense is ensuring that differences are welcomed, different perspectives are respectfully heard, and every individual feels a sense of belonging. And we're going to think about how we can push that into not just perspectives are heard, but perspectives are recognized as things that can be transformative for everybody, right? That can change how we think about the ways that we think in some cases. And then equity for our purposes is, how do we think critically about what we're doing, evaluating systems and institutions to identify and remove biases and barriers in the distribution of opportunities and resources. I want to show you a cartoon that you may already be familiar with a variation of. So I'm guessing, I can't see your faces, whoops, but I'm guessing most of you have in the past seen some variation of a cartoon series that shows people trying to look over a fence, and not everybody can see over a fence. And there may be boxes, and there may eventually be a removal of the fence. And this is one that I just wanted to point out before we go into talking about equity and inclusion, because sometimes when it comes to curriculum design, course design, grading, things like that, there's an assumption that some students need more help or extra help or less help. But this version of this cartoon is unique in that we don't just see people of different heights standing on different numbers of boxes. We've got people of different heights standing on different numbers of boxes, and we're recognizing that boxes don't do some people any good. That in some cases, equity requires a different type of access to knowledge or access to demonstrating success. I hear somebody's microphone. Have we got any questions so far? Or was that just a microphone that was turned on? Okay, cool. So what I'd like to do now is a little collaborative thought exercise. And I'm going to put a link, if you'll bear with me for 1 second. I'm going to put a link into the chat. That we're going to use to think about some questions together throughout the rest of this workshop today. And the first question we're going to think about is this: how do you already promote equity and inclusion in your assignments or assessments, however you describe those things your students do for yourself? So if you go into the Google Doc and look at the first heading, just make some notes. You don't have to sign them, but just jot down some things that you do to promote equity and inclusion. And if you're not teaching right now, you could also think about things that you do with your student workers that might be transferable to how we ask students to demonstrate their knowledge and skills in the classroom. So we'll take a few minutes and do that. I'm seeing some great stuff coming in here. This is fantastic. And I'm just going to start reading some of it out for the recording. Feel free to keep typing. So things that I'm seeing in here under strategies you already use to promote equity and inclusion in assignments or assessments. I see rubrics. I see student choice about processing knowledge and expression of knowledge choices within the assignment. That's actually variations of that are in here at least 3 times. Because I also see alternate methods of knowledge demonstrations, such as verbal exams and flexible student-defined assignments and goals, or options for assignment mechanics, like having group options versus individual options, writing versus audio versus video, etc. Multiple explanations for each topic, so having a lecture, having access to YouTube videos or TED Talks. Multiple types of assignments in each topic, dropping the lowest score, I think is what that means. So that in a given, I'm assuming this means so that in a given unit, the student's grade is not reliant on only one kind of assignment. I don't know who put that there, but am I right?
Yes, the basic idea would be then you can fail forward. You can fail an assignment and then do something else and improve on it.
Awesome. Yeah. That's great. Transparent assignment descriptions, I put that there. We'll come back to that. Choices of topic, inclusive introductions of yourself, such as using pronouns. showing up when issues arise, trying to include a variety of culture references in scenarios, visual representation in slide decks and in authors, offer times to discuss offline or out of class when holding things that might have different power dynamics. So chances to discuss scholarships, transportation, group meetings, etc. Weekly assignments like a quiz or an equivalent where students can practice the skill for the week. So sometimes we call those formative assignments that in one form or another can be geared toward practice and skill development rather than like, this is your grade on this topic. This is all really great stuff. Thank you everyone for contributing to that. So it's clear to me that all of you are already doing this type of work, and that because you're already doing this type of work, I don't want to present myself as an expert here or as the strategies that I'm going to talk about as the be all end all. We've got a great grab bag there of things that you can work with, and it may be that some of the things that I present work for you and some of them do not, and that is totally fine. The other piece to keep in mind here is we are thinking cross-disciplinarily, and because I am a biased human, the things that I'm going to talk about are influenced by my experience as a humanities teacher. The ideas that Mike brings to the table here and has in previous conversations are influenced by him teaching in about as opposite a discipline as you can to the disciplines I teach in. And so I'm excited to have everybody's contributions here. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more and then I'm going to shut up. Some straightforward strategies to try. Again, not the be all and end all, but 3 things that can be helpful in lots of different types of classes in one way or another, and are just intended to spark your thinking. And these are the strategies we're going to talk about today. We're going to dedicate a little bit more disproportionate amount of time to transparent assignment design because it's something that's a really well-studied equity strategy, and it's been shown to be particularly beneficial for minoritized students, first-generation students, and students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. And at the same time, it is also really best practices for assignment design and communication because it benefits every single student. And it also really helps with grading and helping you think concretely about your expectations. If you were at the March ITS, CCM, or Stiller division meetings, I know at least one person here was, you've heard me talk about this to some extent. Agency, so giving students choices in ways that suit your outcomes and support those outcomes, is a little bit less concrete than transparency, but it's a really powerful way to promote inclusion, belonging, and also relevance. Agency helps with buy-in and engagement. It's a great way to ensure that knowledges that come from experience are given some space in your classroom in conversation with more traditional kinds of academic knowledge. So often in academic settings, we don't see the knowledges that come to students from their cultural context, from their family experiences, from their personal experiences and passions, activism, their jobs, their families, things like that. Sometimes those knowledges are not treated as a legitimate source. And this is one way to take those knowledges, legitimize them in an environment where students may not have experienced that before, and then have them use the skills you're teaching with those knowledges. And finally, modes. By modes, I mean types of assignments, and this is something that in your notes came up repeatedly in different forms. Choice of mode is a way to reach and recognize the progress of learners who excel at some types of assignments and assessments, but encounter barriers to demonstrating the outcomes that come from the form of the assignment rather than their ability with the outcome itself. So choices and varieties of mode can help students in particular with some kinds of disabilities. They can be very helpful for English language learners. They can be helpful for students who are underprepared in some of the skills that we kind of assume everyone has, which I'll touch on a little bit later. And they can, and I'll sort of speak from personal teaching experience here, they can be helpful for students who look at like a paper assignment and their brain just kind of disconnects and runs screaming for the hills. And having multiple modes, the same with an exam. So having multiple modes of demonstrating knowledge can increase their chances for success and decrease the amount of stress on their mental health. So we'll come back to each of these in more detail. The last thing I want to put out on this slide is that some of these have stars, these sort of sub-strategies. And the reason for that is that those items are also helpful for accessibility. So one thing that, as you think more about designing for DEI, is that you're going to notice over your process of thinking about this, is that strategies that serve DEI also often serve universal design for learning in terms of making things more accessible. Okay, any questions about that? Good, okay. So transparency, and I'll ask Mike to bear with me here because he's heard this. Transparent design is a really well-studied model that has a simple premise. If we understand how students perceive and approach assignments and how they learn from them, then we can create all kinds of assessment tools, whether that's tests, papers, homework assignments, programming labs, whatever, that set them up for success because we're thinking about what they understand about that assignment, and how they're approaching it. We're thinking about metacognition, as well as what we actually want them to produce. And so when we talk about transparent assignment design, a lot of times what we're talking about is how do you think through it and then present that to students. This has been studied really thoroughly, and documented positive effects include increased academic confidence, sense of belonging, and employable skills, particularly for students who have some kind of identity or demographic characteristic that's usually associated with decreased academic confidence, decreased academic confidence, sense of belonging, or achievement in their classes. So another thing that transparency helps us do when we're using this model as we design assignments is to think about our outcomes. And thinking about outcomes helps us stay focused on equity. What do we need our students to take away? Let's set aside some of the window dressing for a moment. And we want to address those outcomes without relying on things that can generate a lot of opaque or unspoken expectations. So the first thing that you need to know when you're doing this transparent assignment design strategy is to know your outcomes. And then in the next slides, we're going to talk about equity and articulating how to get to those outcomes in an assignment design. So let's jump back to our Google Doc and look down at question number 2, so the second page, and think about your outcomes and how you currently assess those outcomes. For folks who are not teaching right now, you could think about classes that you took in your education, and how, like, what you perceived to be the outcomes of those classes and how they were assessed. Apologies, I think I destroyed everyone's bullets. While y'all are doing that, I'm going to go create some blank bullets in the third section so that we don't have that problem again. Okay. Yeah, you can tell from reading these responses that we all teach, whether in the classroom or through coaching, very different things, because pretty much all of our sort of classic assessment types are here. Um, when we think about outcomes, it's also clear that what different people are using is very tied to what they're teaching and also to the particular skills they want to develop. So some things that I see here, again, reading for the recorder, cumulative assessment, oral assessments, pre-class reading with leading questions, so you can get a sense of, are they following along? Quizzes of different types, tests of different types and in various forms, so including in-class, take-home, open notes, etc. Projects, which is a whole, when we think about a transparent assignment design, projects are a huge venue in which this method can be helpful. Formative scaffolded pieces with reflection, so considering the self, some processes and meaning, feedback from peers and from the teacher, and then a summative assessment with reflection, so the metacognition piece there. Pre-writing or other types of scaffolded assignments to assess different types of skills in development. These are all great ideas, awesome, and I see people are continuing to add, which is great. Please feel free to do so. So transparent assignment design is something that can actually serve all of these types of assessments, even though something that is particularly valuable for projects, you might sort of be asking, what has this got to do with tests? But when we talk about assignment design, we're not talking about just what is the assignment description that your students get and what is the evaluation system. We're also talking about how is that assessment piece framed to your students? How do you talk about your exam before it happens? How do you conduct review hours and things like that? So on this slide, it says transparent assignments clearly state purpose, task, and criteria. But by clearly state, that does not necessarily mean they state it on paper, right? It's just that these things should be clearly evident to your students. So when we talk about purpose, task, and criteria, the purpose piece, right, is a metacognitive starting point for the students. It's basically, how does this fit into the class? What's being assessed here? What am I going to learn or practice? And then also, why should I, a human person, not just an assignment producing machine, why should I care about this? What does it mean for me? And then the task is a description of what they have to do. How exactly should I, the student, approach this topic or task, and what exactly do I need to produce? Task is a place that sometimes faculty who are teaching, particularly in disciplines that require students to do a lot of independent thinking and produce something like a paper or a presentation. Faculty sometimes get hung up here because we talk a lot about what we want them to think about, because that's really important to us, but don't necessarily always provide detailed information about what exactly they have to do, which is something that students really value. And then the third piece, the criteria piece, what are the parameters of this assignment and how will I, the student, be graded so that I can anticipate this correctly? Someone mentioned rubrics in the earlier collaborative exercise in the document as a strategy for equity. Rubrics are a great way to enhance how you describe criteria and requirements. So are examples of past work. And speaking of examples, we have several sample transparently designed assignments, including this one that's screenshot here. And then also, let me see if I can get this to share. This is a reflective assignment that came at the end of the semester. So this is one I actually used, and then I went back and revised the assignment for this workshop to make it a little clearer what I was doing. But it outlines, how is this connected with the course? Why do you care? What exactly have you got to do? I like to use steps when I describe tasks because we have some students who they look at a big assignment and they get sort of paralyzed about it, especially when they have to come up with their own idea. And breaking it down into steps can make that a little bit more manageable, lets them know where to start. I have an example in here, which in this case is in a footnote. And then I didn't provide a rubric with this, but I provided a very clear grading breakdown that also states how this is going to affect their grade in the course. And part of the reason, let me get back to the slides here. There's several reasons for doing it this way. This is very helpful for students who experience different kinds of marginalization, and we could talk for an hour about why that is in the context of different forms of marginalization. But just to give a couple of examples, if you have a student who is first generation, they do not know the unspoken requirements of write a paper. And so when we think about task as here's what you have to do, and criteria as here's proportionally how you'll be evaluated, that takes away some of that obscurity, right? It makes some of this clearer to those students who don't have the advantage of having a parent who wrote a lot of essays in college, who maybe saw their work in high school. This is also helpful to students whose high school, in whatever discipline they're studying, underprepared them. It's helpful for students who have less experience in your discipline than other students in the class. So there was an ITS faculty member who mentioned to me that he writes his assignments in a particular way because he comes into class knowing that some of his students have tons of experience with programming, and some of them are really good at grasping the concepts, but they don't speak in the same way, right? They don't have they're not as used to working in the context of a programming class. And so transparency can help with that. Transparency can help students with executive function challenges, students who need to prioritize multiple life responsibilities. If they're able to look at the criteria and say, okay, this part of the assignment is worth 60%. I know I can't give 100% effort to this assignment, so I'm going to focus my effort on that because it's what's weighted the most. And then transparency also helps us, because when we know what we're looking for, which the process of doing transparent assignment design helps us determine, then grading is faster and more equitable, and you spend less time going back and trying to figure out what you asked and whether students are interpreting your assignment reasonably, even if it's not what you expected. Okay, that's transparency. Does anybody have any questions about that? We will move through the other two suggestions a little bit faster, I think. And then we'll get to the fun part, which is working together. Okay. So as we move into thinking about agency and different modes of doing assignments, I want to highlight this quotation by Bell Hooks. If you're not familiar with Hooks, she's the author of Teaching to Transgress, which is a seminal work in equity and pedagogy. She actually passed away this past fall. She was a very important Black woman theorist of pedagogy and inequity in education in the United States, among other things. And I totally recommend her book. But one thing that she asked is, in an educational context, who gets to speak? Who is supposed to be the one listening? And also, who pays attention to what other people and different people are saying? And what are the dynamics behind that? Why? And so when we think about student agency in how they do the assignment, one thing that we're thinking about that is, who is speaking? Is all of the information coming from you or the textbook, or is some knowledge coming from the student? Who is listening? What do you and your students consider to be worth listening to? Who are you listening to? And why? What are the dynamics behind that? So thinking about agency is a way to break down some of the inequities and exclusions that are behind Hooks having to ask those questions. That's very theoretical. Fortunately, ways to increase agency in your course assignments and assessments can actually be fairly simple. So these types of student choices, and I've got some of these up on the slide, They're good for everyone in that they support student engagement and the relevance of your assignment for future careers, and they allow students to pursue the ideas and situations and things that they're passionate about, but may not be represented directly in your curriculum. And that could mean giving students a choice of what topic to work on. It could give them a choice. It could mean giving them a choice of which content from the course they're going to follow up on in a more independent assignment. It could mean giving them a choice of who they are speaking to in that assignment. Are they speaking to you? Are they speaking to their peers? Are they doing a sample project that might be used by an activist group or a company? This type of stuff could be really relevant or not relevant depending on your discipline. And are there opportunities for experiential learning? These types of options can really affect people in different ways. So for many students, this can take an assignment from, this is interesting, to an opportunity to engage with students, engage with things that might have affected them in ways that they haven't affected their classmates. So for example, I used to teach American religion courses, and I had students pick a research project topic. The limitation for this was basically, if you can persuade me it's got something to do with religion in the Americas, you can use this as your final project topic. Which is interesting for everybody, I hope. Certainly, I got a lot of interesting papers out of it. But potentially, it means something very different to an immigrant Muslim woman from Africa who can write about the variations of Black Muslim identity than it does to a white male student who chooses a compelling and entertaining and interesting topic like an avant-garde arts-driven religious commune. Both of those students have written really interesting stuff. The first student has had an opportunity to engage with something that is probably very meaningful to her life experience and her educational experience. Those are both real examples, by the way, and they were great papers. It also provides an opportunity for students to engage engage with a topic they're passionate about and converse with the instructor or peer reviewers that doesn't fall into the spokesperson trap. So if you're not familiar with the spokesperson trap, that's the idea that you're in class as the instructor, you're talking about some kind of topic related to underrepresented perspectives, and you find yourself looking at or reminding yourself not to look at that student who you perceive as representing that identity or that experience. And then in the worst cases, a faculty member calling on that person to represent their identity or experience to the class, which is really alienating for those students. So giving agency in classwork can allow students to engage with those topics and ideas that are important to them without feeling like they're being called out. This obviously works in research type projects. It also clearly works with the arts. I have heard examples of it working in quantitative classes. So Warren Sides described a project where he has students choose a statistical data set that they work with in all of their projects and assignments across the semester. And it can be about anything. So it can be about something that's very relevant to them. And then one of the things they talk about is how statistics are used, what the effects of them are in real life. All of which is to say that you can do something that's really simple, like choose your own paper topic, choose your data set and work with it in this circumscribed way that I need you to do to judge the outcomes, and have a really fairly profound impact on students' experience of how they belong in the classroom. Or for students who don't experience stress about that, they engage more, and that also is useful to you. The other piece that I have here on the slide is the idea of knowledges and different knowledges. This is, again, something we could spend a lot of time on, but I want to acknowledge, at least in passing, that there are ways of knowledge making and types of knowledge that have always been acknowledged as valuable in higher education. And that includes ways of assessing knowledge. So like reading, analytic writing, testing, structured experimentation, class presentations, skill demonstrations, things like that. But we can also look at ways to honor other kinds of knowledges and also other kinds of demonstrating knowledges, which we'll transition into in a second. And that might include collecting oral history. It might include storytelling. It might include an assignment that has a performance option of some kind or a creative media option of some kind. It might include experiential learning in the form of community engagement, and then reflecting on that. So when we think about knowledges, we can think about what is the full range of things available to students as they go through the process of demonstrating their outcomes in your course. Okay. Finally, and I want to cover sort of both of these things, agency related to topics and knowledges, and choices of mode together, and then we're going to do another reflection exercise on that. So alongside exploring different kinds of knowledges and providing opportunities for students to demonstrate their learning in different ways, we should also think about the how of the assignment, right? How do we complete the assignment? And again, and I know I've said this several times, this involves coming back to your course's outcomes. So what we might be thinking about, traditionally, I have given a test or I have assigned a paper. What are other ways that I could assess those outcomes without using that structure? Or I might want to use that structure, but I might want to provide some opportunities for students to deviate from it, right? So one way that I do this, again, as a humanities teacher, is I assign a paper. I also give an option for a podcast, like a group panel podcast or something like that. And I have students, occasionally take me up on that option. Or I could do it the other way, having a media project and having an option to write about it instead. I would love to talk as we move through into the more collaborative section of this workshop about ways that this could work in other types of disciplines, particularly if you are in a test-heavy discipline, how you can think about mode and outcomes that typically are assessed by testing. So I'm going to leave this slide up and invite you to go back to our Google Doc for a minute. And think about that third question in the Google Doc. You can also think about these questions on the slide. So our third question there asks you to brainstorm ways to introduce student choices and agency in your class. And I ask you to do this with your course's outcomes and how you usually have students demonstrate those outcomes. So the second question on here in mind. And you are welcome to remove those letters in the bullet points. Those are only there because I wanted it to keep making bullet points. These are great things that are coming in here. I'm going to read a few. Several of them are actual examples. So the first one references a faculty member who's not here. Having an interview with professionals in the field with some prompts provided to help students demonstrate their understanding of key concepts and the outcomes of the course. Applying theoretical ideas or skills from the course to a favorite literary or media work from outside the course reading list. Asking students what they feel they should or could be assessed on. Giving students option for completing the same task where they can choose which method reflects their ability to engage with the material, so verbal, written, structurally, etc. Again, enlisting students in the conversation on assessment practices for this group, that's great. Using, again, use a wide array of practices so that students can pick from multiple strategies. Or I think in the first question, somebody referenced in any given unit having multiple types of assignments, that is modes of assessment, so that students have opportunities to succeed. Allowing students to choose their topic. And then there's an example here about shifting the parameters of an assignment to accommodate an emergent situation like COVID, recognizing that students' context and needs had changed. Those are all really great ideas as well. Thank you. Okay, so the questions that we have on this slide, if you're still able to see the slide, are ones that you can certainly keep in mind. And when you go through thinking about the types of things that you were just writing about in the document, these questions can help you guide, as you try to get out of an assignment where you've always done the same thing. And I can pull them up again later if we want. Okay, I have here some what I call frequently anticipated questions. These are things that I'm happy to talk about if you want to, but I don't want to belabor the point. I would love to get onto the collaborative stuff so that we have a good chunk of time for that. I've got these up on the screen. Does anybody want to particularly talk about one or more of these questions? And if not, we'll go to the collaborative stuff. So raise your hand if you do. Or if you have other questions that are not the ones that I anticipate. Okay, cool. So we're going towards activity time now. Thank you for bearing with all the talking. I really appreciate it. And I know that it can be particularly a drag when we're in a virtual environment like this. All right, so what I want to do now is turn toward thinking about the situations that you have found yourself in, and particularly about assignments that you are designing. So again, I'm going to put the format of this on the table for everybody to contribute their ideas. This was originally designed as a think, pair, share. I know we have one person in this group who has some, like a very concrete thing that they're working on in terms of revising an assignment or thinking about how else to do an assignment. Based on our conversation earlier, I'm not sure anyone else is in that purpose or in that position. So we could do a think, pair, share on these topics, thinking sort of hypothetically about your teaching, or we could do a working group for Mike. Then we create a kind of organic space for questions and ideas from other people. What would you all prefer to do? If you could put something in the chat or say it out loud, that would be great. Rebecca says, let's focus on Mike's. Mike, are you okay with that?
Yeah, that'll be fine. I'm not sure if it's interesting enough to add to the recording, but
yeah, I'm happy to turn the recording off if that would be a little bit easier to, have this conversation.
Just because I know sometimes it's hard to just watch a conversation when it's not as, so it's kind of targeted.
Yeah.
It doesn't make a difference to me.
Yeah, I will stop the recording now. Does anybody have, before we do that, does anybody have any questions or comments that you think might be useful to have in the recording for later, like if we post it on YouTube?
My only thought is the challenge of the diversity of practice, right? I
Yes.
mean, with not enough time in the day to acknowledge our faculty having to, you saying, I allow them to do a podcast. I now have to grade a podcast and a paper.
Right. Right.
So there's challenges that come along with it. So I think it's good to acknowledge that and express the importance of allowing our students to show up in their best way and be critiqued or graded in a way that suits them, because we know that there's a lot of different ways to learn. So that's all I got to say.
Yeah. Oh, that's absolutely right. And I'm glad that you brought that up, because it is in the notes on some slide somewhere in here. And I didn't cover it, which is that any of the decisions that faculty make about this should be made with the outcomes in mind, but also with, what can you as a teacher reasonably do with the students that you have, that both maximizes their opportunities for success and doesn't make things too crazy for you. And so having, one or two options for certain types of assignments and circumscribing that's totally fine. Having strong parameters in which students have to pick a topic, that's totally fine. One reason that I stress transparency in this is because it's something where if you are already designing an assignment, transparency is a lot about thinking in advance about how you're going to grade it, which saves time later, and also how you write it up. And so that's something that kind of maximizes the time faculty are already spending. But Lisa, you're exactly right to say that, we do have to acknowledge the realities that faculty live in, as well as the realities that our students live in. Thank you for that.
And I'll just chime in and just remind folks who are listening to this that, we're always talking about progress over perfection. So it may be that, as Caroline said, you change one assignment this next semester, and then you look at maybe changing another assignment the following semester. And with that, getting feedback from the students and working through then how that grading process went, and if there would be a way to make that assessing time frame more efficient by building into it some peer review or something like that. That the CLT is here to help you sort of figure that piece out and not make you feel so overwhelmed that it all has to happen all at once.
Exactly. Yes. This whole conversation is meant to be a bag of strategies from which you can choose on whatever scale is feasible for you right now. And it might be that you accumulate those over time, or it might be that you're like, yeah, this has really solved a lot of my problems with, transparency has solved a lot of my problems with my homework assignments, and that each semester you revise your assignment descriptions over time. So all of that is optional, and nobody should feel like they have to do everything, especially all at once.